Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I was just giving it a few minutes for everybody to join us. There are still a few people, I think, logging on, but we'll make a start. My name's Alice Reeve, and I'm joined today by my colleague Allison Cook. We're focusing today on managing absence. For those of you who want a recording of the event, it is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be sent out shortly after the event. If you've got any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to go through those. If you've got any technical issues, pop them in the chat, and our colleague Ellie is on hand to help you with that. Managing sickness absence is a topic I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, but we were prompted to look at it today as a result of some recent statistics, which we will go through, as well as some recently released ACAS guidance on managing absence as well. We thought we'd look at both of those and then move on to some key practical issues around how you can effectively tackle absence. So looking at how you can contact somebody when they phone in sick, keeping in touch during their absence, tackling when they've got lots of intermittent short-term absence, and managing a return to work. We're focused primarily on short-term absence in this case, but obviously lots of the principles apply to long-term absence as well. So let's move on and look at a bit of the data. The CIPD did their annual health and wellbeing at work report and have reported that employee sickness absence is at its highest ever level for over the last decade. It's currently running at about 7.8 days per annum per employee, which compared to back to 2019 levels pre-COVID was 5.8 days. So quite significant difference in the average when you look at everybody. In terms of what's the reason for that? Well, COVID is still, can't get away from COVID, still knocking around. It's the fourth highest reason for absence on the list, with half of the organisations who responded to the survey also reporting that they've got some employees with long COVID, which is impacting on absence rates as well. But it's obviously not the only or even the main reason for absence. That still goes to stress-related absence, and 76% of the organisations who completed the survey report some stress-related absence amongst their employees. I think for us, we know that most employers that we work with, and many of you, will have been focusing on mental well-being as part of your management of employee well-being, and it's obviously an important area to continue to focus on. You've probably got a whole range of things in place, from employee assistance lines to counselling availability to mental health first aiders and champions in the workplace. But the stats are pretty stark, and it's definitely worth taking stock as to what you've had in place for how long, what's working, engaging with staff to see what's effective, what's valued, and what's actually helping in terms of addressing some of those issues. It's clear that there are some other underlying issues around sort of workload and management style as well. And I think those perhaps have been impacted by the pandemic as well, particularly those of us who are working hybridly. You'll see that we're at home today, and actually setting those boundaries and juggling workload, perhaps the challenges of management remotely. There are lots of things that are interplaying into stress-related absence, which is worth looking at and unpicking. Thought it was interesting that, notwithstanding the high absence rates that we're seeing, organisations reported presenteeism at quite a high rate. So 87% of those responding said that they witnessed individuals coming to work or undertaking work when they were unwell, and a significant proportion, 63%, also observing that employees were essentially working when they should be taking time off, so when they were on annual leave or outside of their contracted hours. And that did cause me pause to reflect really and just think about this. And I think it's really important that when you're looking at managing absence, you tackle it in the round and look at it in a holistic way. If you've got a strategy around around absence, I think it starts with what steps have you got in place to ensure that you're managing employees' health and well-being at work? What have you got? What's working? That's a starting point. Obviously, then you want a culture so that if people are genuinely off sick, they are able to be off sick and don't feel the pressure to be at work, but actually then manage back to work as quickly as possible and effectively and supported in that. And I think if you can address all those themes, you will have an effective strategy for managing absence and essentially ensuring that people who are sick don't work and that or only do the bits they can, and that people who are well are at work and working effectively, which is obviously what you ultimately want to achieve. There are obviously a wide range of issues here to address, and I thought it was really surprising that only 30% of those organisations that responded provided guidance or training for managers on supporting people with health conditions to remain at work. Obviously, we're not really going to stray hugely into the Equality Act today, though Alison may mention it, but there are lots of perhaps challenging and difficult issues, including legal risk in this area, as well as on the ground practical and operational issues. So I think that really indicated to me that there is a gap here that you can be looking at to ensure that your managers feel confident and have the tools they need to manage absence. So some really interesting statistics, I think, help set the context for perhaps how you might move forward to address this issue. ACAS obviously recognise this as an challenging topic for employers. So if we can just move on to the next slide, they updated their guidance on managing sickness back in August. There's nothing groundbreaking there. All of you will be familiar with pretty much everything that the guidance says, but it is really useful. And actually, we do quite often have pushback from employees who say, well, they can't be contacted or they're off sick, you can't do this, you can't do that. And actually, the ACAS guidance gives you some really good tools to manage absence and perhaps the confidence to provide your managers with clear guidance as to how to manage absence and engage with staff who are repeatedly off sick or who are absent from work and to deal with those individuals themselves. It covers a whole range of things from sick pay entitlement and fit notes and how you can manage that proof of sickness all the way through to effectively recording absence, looking at trigger points and having absence policies in place as well. So as I say, I don't think there'll be anything there that you're not familiar with, but it's a really useful resource and reminder of some areas of good practice. There is no doubt that there are some really simple and effective things that you can do as an organisation to address absence levels if you consider that they're an issue within the organisation. And we thought we'd spend a little bit of time reflecting on those. The starting point is actually back to the notification requirements. What does it say in your contract and your policies, and what happens in practice in terms of when an employee needs to notify you that they're not able to come into work? Who do they contact and how? I'm quite mean. I would say make that a bit more difficult. If they can just send a text message to an anonymous absence number, it's relatively easy to roll over if you're not feeling up to it and not come into work. But actually, is it better that they have to phone their line manager or phone somebody in HR, a named person who can talk to them? I think ideally it would be a telephone call if you can, not only to perhaps make it more difficult to go off work in those borderline cases, but also to make sure that you're properly capturing the reason for their absence. Is absolutely appropriate in most cases for the person who's receiving that call to ask why somebody's off sick and to capture that and ask if they have any idea how long they might be off sick for. Obviously, they may not know, but you can ask the question and you should capture that information as well. Depending on the nature of the reason given, it might also be appropriate to ask how it happened. So if someone's got a back pain or something like that, for example, to say how did it happen can be relevant. Of course, capturing whether it actually happened at work, which may trigger other processes as well, is important. Think about who is involved in those phone conversations, and that they feel confident and able to have those calls and communicate effectively, that they don't say anything that's likely to get the organisation into trouble, but equally they gain the information that you do need, which might include thinking about work that needs to be carried out, a contact number for them if they're happy to be contacted when they're off sick, if there are any key things they need to hand over or need to be done when they're off. And it's entirely reasonable to ask for all of those things as well. You might want to think about whether there's anything in the sickness policy that they need to do, for example, where they might find the self-certification forms or those things as well. And it's worth everybody in the organisation understanding those notification requirements and making sure that they're enforced, because I think what we see is that they slip and that people might message their friend or their colleague who then sort of reports it in on their behalf. And actually, it's important that we break those habits and have a really clear and rigorous notification processes as well. After having the call, it's also critical that absence is recorded properly. I have to say, I think it's one of my bugbears. It's really, really difficult to manage absence effectively and consistently across employees if you haven't got good data to start with. And again, this is something where you really need the support of your managers so that you know that you've got a really good record of when people are off and the reason for that. And you've got a distinction between, say, holiday, perhaps family friendly leave or other absences, and when they are off sick themselves. And obviously that comes up as well, whether they're caring for dependents as opposed to being sick themselves, and if they are sick themselves, what the cause of that sickness absence is. And that should be accurately recorded. It's also important to capture where people go off sick partway through the day. That's often something that slips, and it feels like someone's always off, but actually if they've come in first thing, there's not an accurate way of recording that. So you can only look at triggers and look at managing absence properly if you have got that those records organised. And so again, it's something that's worth looking at from your organisation and seeing what you can do. So just moving on to the next slide. Obviously, you'll appreciate that generally when an employee is off sick for short term, they need to self-certify. So they just provide their own self-certification. We sometimes get asked whether it's possible to ask them to provide a fit note at an earlier date. Now, that isn't possible for the purpose of SSP. You know, they will meet the SSP requirements, statutory sick pay requirements, if they've self-certified, but you can have more onerous requirements in your organisation. You have to think quite carefully about that, whether it's appropriate. It might be if they've been having persistent absence, or particularly on certain days of the week, it might be really useful for, you know, to ask them to provide fit notes. Obviously, there's always a burden on organisations providing fit notes as well. So there's a bit of a tension there, but can be a useful thing to do. And really importantly, before I hand over to Alison, I would say that I think it's really important that communication is managed effectively between HR and line management, as well as the employee. Obviously, quite often we see that either the line manager knows quite a lot about an employee's sickness, how much time they've had off and the reasons for that, but that doesn't effectively then get recorded or passed on to HR so that they can have oversight and manage that effectively. Or alternatively, sometimes it's compartmentalized and HR have all of that visibility and the line manager doesn't. So it's really, really important that you look at it as an organisation and work together effectively to manage the issues. And it's only then that you'll be able to consider, have we got you know, an issue here, a problem that we need to address? Are there any underlying factors? And do we need to intervene? And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Alison, who's going to talk about some of the things that you might opt to do.
Many thanks, Alice. I don't know if some of you may have seen me fiddling around with my screen. I was just having a look at some of the chat that's going on in the chat box and in the Q&A box. So it looks like your section already, Alice, is provoking some interesting points and sort of discussions. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to just look through how to keep in touch during illness. And this can be an area of conflict between the employee and the employer, and I can certainly recall cases that I've dealt with in the past where what the employer thought was being a concerned employer, supportive employer, the employee perceived as being harassing and doubting the veracity of their sickness absence. So it's really important that you think through how you keep in touch during a period of ill health, and how much is the right amount of contact, and how the contact is made. Is it a welfare visit? Is it a telephone call? Is it an email? Is it, you know, something like that? In terms of how to determine the appropriate amount of contact, part of the answer to that is it depends, which is, you know, not entirely satisfactory answer, but it will think about what that individual seniority is, and what the reason for the absence is likely to be. So if it's I've broken my leg and I'm not going to be able to undertake my role as a sports teacher for 6 weeks, then you've got a time frame really for when that person's likely to come back, unless of course there's any sort of complications. If they have got COVID or something similar to that, again, there's likely to be a time frame to work to. But again, different people have different amounts of time off depending on how poorly they are with these sorts of things. So it is important that expectations are set in advance. And as we say on the screen there is a balance between offering support and feeling like somebody is applying pressure for them to come back to work, perhaps before they are ready to. So, and as I said, I've certainly seen cases where an employee feels that they've been harassed. I think it's important that, as with many things with the employment relationship, that the expectations are set and everybody knows what it's going to look like in terms of how frequently or otherwise an employee may or may not be contacted. It's probably useful to either set that out at the beginning of the absence, if that's relevant or appropriate, or to set it out in a policy. So if there is any concern about it, you can direct the employee back to the policy, and so there can't be any dispute as to why they're being contacted and how regularly they're being contacted, and the purpose for the contact. So it's not to say we don't believe that you are generally unwell, excuse me, or you know, rushing them back to work before they're ready. Sorry, slightly distracted there because somebody says that they can't see the slides on the screen. So I don't know, Ellie, if you can look at that. If we move on to the next slide. So keeping in touch during a period of ill health, your approach is likely to be different depending on what the sort of illness is. If it's a long term absence, you probably need to think about it in a different way rather than a short-term absence, so sort of COVID, flu, upset tummy, those sorts of things. So where you have got somebody on long-term absence, you might want to consider inviting them to major events that you as an organisation are holding, and you might also, if they're involved in a project, for example, that's going on for some period of time, you might want to contact them to make sure that the organisation is in the loop, and that a ball is not dropped in terms of a project that they may be working on, and that's entirely appropriate. And then just moving on to the next bullet, the bullet, not slide. Thank you. Yes, the Health and Safety Executive has produced some guidance, which again talks in general terms about how to support disabled workers and workers with long-term health conditions, and talks through recommendations around maintaining appropriate contact. So that's worth going to have a look at their recommendations and thinking through how you might want to do it, or how you might want to tweak what you're doing at the moment. Again, depending on the length of absence, you might want to refer that individual to an occupational health professional. And I'm presuming that many of you are familiar with that. But you do need to think about how that process will be managed and the circumstances when you think it appropriate to refer that individual to an occupational health specialist. There are lots of things that you have to do in terms of facilitating that referral, in terms of employee consent and so on, and hopefully that will be set out in a policy and procedure again. So there isn't that surprise or the concern in relation to why you're doing that and making that referral. It's really about information, isn't it, in terms of understanding that individual's ill health and their prognosis, and when they're likely to be back at work, and when they can come back, what they're able to do and not able to do. Those are sort of the process that you need to think about where somebody is off on longer term absence rather than the short periods of absence. Again, just looking at the bullet, I'm not going to say next bullet for fear of moving on, but really important to maintain a thorough paper trail, follow up phone calls with emails perhaps, just to clarify what's been said and if appropriate, what's been agreed. The number of times that we see issues like this go into a sort of a dispute territory is where one person's recollection of what's been discussed is different from the HR or the manager's perspective, and you end up with thinking that these two people may have been on a different call entirely. So to try and avoid those sorts of disputes or differences of recollection, shall we say, really important to just do a quick follow-up after that phone call, just to say, good to speak to you, this is what we talked about, and this is what was agreed, and I'll be in contact in whatever's been agreed in terms of that sort of information. And then just on this final bullet, the Information Commissioner's Office has issued guidance around how to keep information about workers' health. And essentially, I would recommend that you go and have a look at that guidance. But essentially what it talks about is limiting the number of individuals who have access to information about workers' health, which is, personal and sensitive and goes a bit further than the information you routinely keep on somebody's file. So limit the number of people who have access to it, and also keep it separately so that it's secure, so that it is in a secure place and can't be accessed other than is necessary to access, if that makes sense. So I think that's a really good tip, and something that we probably don't always think about or do. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So tackling regular short-term absence. This is tricky because there isn't usually a pattern. You might have your suspicions, especially in circumstances where absence may occur on a Monday or a Friday. And it's difficult to sort of pin down, but things to think through are, is there a pattern emerging? So is there a pattern, as I said, on a Monday or a Friday? Is there a pattern after a bank holiday? Is it only ever certain days of the week? Is it the timing of an absence? So another classic is where somebody asks for holiday, for whatever reason the holiday has been refused, and that individual goes off sick. So think about things like that. I sound very cynical. Other things to think about, is there an underlying health condition? Is the employee disabled? So Alice alluded to whether or not there's an Equality Act issue here. Are the absences genuine, and consider obtaining medical advice. It's very difficult, isn't it, where somebody phones in and says, I've got an upset tummy, or I've got COVID, or I've got flu, or I've got a migraine. Those are the types of absences that are not necessarily going to be certified by a doctor. And it's also quite difficult to go to an individual and say, actually, I don't believe that you're not well, or I don't believe that you're not sufficiently unwell to mean that you can't come to work. And actually questioning somebody on that could go to trust and confidence. And if there are other issues going on as well, you could find yourself in difficulty. If there is a pattern, if there is something in relation to somebody having lots of migraines, for example, just using that as an example, it might be that an appropriate referral or getting some medical advice as to whether or not there's additional support that we can give that employee, which would mean that the incidence of migraine would be reduced. There may not be, but it might be worth thinking through and thinking about whether or not there's something that you could do to reduce that. Obviously, invoking employer policies is something that you might want to think about. So your sickness absence policy or capability procedure, there may well be some trigger points in there. So once you've reached a certain level of sickness absence in a 12-month period, the sickness absence policy is triggered, and you start a formal process that way. You may find that invoking that policy or talking through with the employee that you're getting near to those trigger points, and it may be something that you'll be forced to do, will do the trick, in that the employee recognises that it sounds awful, doesn't it? But you're on their case. You recognise there's an issue here, and that their attendance needs to improve. Obviously, any policy will go through a fair process, warnings, etc. And obviously, the individuals will have the statutory right to be accompanied to those meetings where dismissal might be considered. So think about what the timescales for improvement are, and look, again, as I've just alluded to earlier, think about offering support and any adjustments in relation to their sickness absence. Short-term absences are difficult though, and no easy way. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is a case which considered short-term absence, and it's considered as the leading case on dismissal for short-term intermittent absences. It's the case of Lincock and Cereal Packaging Limited. It's an employment appeal tribunal case, so it is a case that you can rely on if needs be. But basically, this case is authority really to say, you know, enough is enough now. We cannot tolerate this ongoing level of a sickness absence. We've just reached a point where we're going to have to terminate on the grounds of capability. What the case does do is reiterate an earlier case and look at what the correct approach is. So you need to, some of the things that we've just covered in the earlier slide, have a look at the pattern of absence and the reason for the absence. Give the employee a warning in relation to the absence and set the required improvement, and allow a chance for the employee to make representation. So they may turn around and say, do you know what, actually, I'm really struggling. I've got a lot going on at home. I've got dependents who are unwell, and it's making me feel unwell as well. So give them an opportunity to make those sorts of representations that you can then consider, because if you don't, then that's going to potentially lead to some unfairness should you get to a dismissal. Then you need to think about whether or not an improvement has been made, and if not, in those circumstances, a dismissal is likely to be reasonable. So just going back to unfair dismissal, we know, don't we, that in order for a dismissal to be fair, it must be reasonable in all the circumstances. So these steps that have been set out in this case are what you need to think about to get to that sort of reach that reasonableness threshold when you're thinking about dismissal. What I would say, however, is that in this case, the employer didn't obtain a medical report as the absences were for short-term unconnected reasons. But there is a possibility, isn't there, that there might be something underlying which may account for these short-term absences. Things like ME, those sorts of long-term underlying conditions, which could in them by themselves amount to a disability, may well be what is causing these short-term absences, something like that. I suppose by posing that question in the slide, what we're really saying is it might be belt and braces to get a medical report in these circumstances. Every case turns on its own fact, and it won't always be necessary to get a medical report, but it is definitely something to think about in the circumstances. So moving on to the next slide, we've got a poll here just to get a sense of what you all do as part of your absence practice. Do you hold a return to work interview for every absence, no matter how short? Quite a simple yes or no at there. So if you click on the box, on your choice rather, and then we can see what that poll looks like. Alice, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's
Thanks,
okay.
Al. Thanks, that's really interesting. I mean, it does show that the majority of people carry out return to work interviews after every absence, but obviously about a third, just under a third, don't do that. Thanks, Ellie. If we move on, I mean, I think obviously that's a bit of a binary question, and you probably, those who put no might well have return to work interviews at certain stages. I mean, I think return to work interviews are a really important part of managing absence. There was some discussion in the chat box around forms. So generally what you'd expect is that someone returns to work and completes a self-certification form and has to sign it, including their reason for absence at that point. And then there's the decision as to whether there is the return to work interview, yes, for every period of absence, or whether you have one, at certain triggers, or if absence has lasted over a certain period of time. It's important that there is some consistency. And again, in larger organizations, that is so that's really it. In larger organizations, it's really important that there's a consistent approach so that individuals aren't singled out, they can't feel that they're being discriminated against, so that if you're not doing it every time, there's a rationale for that. If you're doing it when people have had met certain triggers, then that's clear and consistent and everybody's doing that, or after a certain length of absence. Return to work interviews, there's a number of reasons for them. The sort of the side on terms of managing their absence, in terms of if people are perhaps inclined to take more time off than they need, it's really useful to look a manager in the eye, and if they know they've got to see somebody, they've got to explain why they've been off and how long they've been off. Someone can talk to them about what the reasons for that are and their pattern of absence. That can act as a really useful deterrent. So it's a really useful tool, but obviously it's just as important or more important to understand actually what was the reason for absence. Is there anything at work that triggered that, or that we need to look at to unpick to help avoid absence in the future? Or do they need anything to support them back in? Any extra phasing in, or any support with duties, or anything, depending on their the reason that they've been off and what they need as well. So return to work interviews should be used to find out all of that information and capture it and record it as well. They can also be useful to remind somebody of how much absence they've taken off in that year, and if that's going to have an impact on their sick pay entitlement too. I can see the chat box is going crazy around making sure that your managers have good training, and absolutely it's really important that you think about who does return to work interviews. Certainly if you're doing them really regularly for most absences, it can't just sit with HR, it's got to be done at management level. And so you do need to make sure that you have regular and consistent training for managers as well in how to do that. And we haven't really touched upon long-term absence, but where you're identifying in this instance that there are underlying issues or a pattern, or it's a long-term cause, it's likely that you will then need to intervene to get some occupational health advice and potentially look at reasonable adjustments and the like to ensure you're meeting your duties under the Equality Act. That's all we were going to say today. Flip over onto the next slide. But you know, it's as if we'd written this, but actually we're obviously happy to help do some bespoke training for organisations around absence management. You yourselves might want to raise awareness about the policies and things as well, and look at what training you've got in place. But our e-learning course also has a really useful refresher for line managers in terms of how to manage absence, and is a good way of disseminating this information quickly across your organisation. So we've just got a poll there. If anyone's interested in learning more about that, please do complete that now, and then we will move on to look at some of the interesting questions that have come up. We'll look at the Q&A box, but I did have an eye on the chat box, and it was interesting. Quite a few of you were talking about the pros and cons of absence lines, and I think you got to the fact that it was better to have some human in touch with people, even if that was to follow up after the event. But we'll look at this. We'll go through the Q&A, and then we'll have a quick look at the chat if there's anything else. Al's joined me, so we can share. I saw this. The first question is whether is long COVID classed as a disability? And I had enough time to see this question to try and remember the name of the case, but it's still not come to me. But essentially, it can be classed as a disability. The guidance on disability under the Equality Act, the definition you'll probably all be familiar with, is whether something's lasted long term. So lasted 12 months or may reasonably last more than 12 months. It feels like long COVID could easily meet that threshold, and it has a substantial adverse effect on someone's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities, so things like mobility, getting into work. So actually long COVID could well meet the criteria to constitute a disability under the Equality Act. We've definitely seen some first instance cases. There was a case in Scotland, I think, and maybe one at an England tribunal as well. We'll pass over to our, where the tribunals have found that individuals suffering from fatigue, brain fog, lethargy, etc., over long periods of time, which impacted on their ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities as a result of long COVID, were disabled and protected under the Equality Act. The ACAS guidance that we've referred to and that I looked at earlier has got a section about COVID. They're more circumspect. They say, oh, well, we're learning about COVID, and it may be a disability, but the critical thing is to put in reasonable adjustments in any event. Al, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, I mean, I suppose what I would say is the threshold is quite low for disability nowadays. Not quite so much probably when Alice went when we first started practicing. So yeah, it's, you know, if an individual can get over the threshold of substantial long-term effect, ability to carry out your normal day-to-day activities, and depending on the nature of long COVID, because obviously it affects people in different ways, it's possible to get over that threshold. And again, you know, each individual case turns on its own facts. one comment I just wanted to make is I think we've created our own little community of HR professionals, which is fabulous, isn't it? Sharing tips and resources, which is brilliant. So that's really nice to see. Whilst I'm more than happy to take questions, I do think this long-term absence during school holidays is probably more
I
your
can
bag
do
than
that, and
mine.
then we'll flip over. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is whether what happens if somebody's on long-term sick over a school holiday period, and what you need to do about pay. Now, I am going to say, unsurprisingly, I really would need to understand what the contract said, what the policy said, and also what type of school you were, as to whether you were bound by, for example, the Burgundy Book, the school teachers pay and conditions document, or whether you're an independent school, or have a different approach, and also how it's worked historically. But generally, the standard, subject to actually having a look at properly at all your documents and what's happened in practice, would be that the holiday periods didn't count against someone's sickness entitlement. So let's say they've got 100 days sick pay, it would be paused and you wouldn't count the holidays towards that, but you would continue to pay them at the level that they were before they were off. So if they had dropped down to half pay or nil pay before the school holidays, that would continue, and they would continue with sick pay through the holidays, but it wouldn't count against their sick pay entitlement. That's how the Burgundy Book works and how most schools work, but I would look at your specific arrangements, and generally an individual would have to get signed back fit and produce a fit note that they were fit to work during if they'd been off sick before the holidays, in order to then receive full pay as normal. And it's definitely worth including that in your policy, so that they can't just suddenly say, well, my sick note happens to have expired, say on the 7th of July, and now I'm entitled to full pay during the holidays, and then I'm back off sick on the 1st of September again. So it's definitely worth looking at your policies around that and tightening it up if you can. Al, do
Great.
you want to pick up the next one?
Yeah, I think the next one's fairly straightforward. Just saying that you're not well is not going to be sufficient for your policies, presumably, and you do need to understand the nature of the illness. If nothing else, too, as Alice alluded to earlier and sort of went through, to understand whether there are any patterns, issues, things that you as an employer need to know, support, etc. So I would definitely recommend that you push back, and if possible, refer to a process and procedure, so it's not just you being difficult. What you might just need to be slightly wary of is if there is some sort of personal sensitivity around the nature of their illness, which they may feel uncomfortable disclosing to their line manager, and they may want to do it via HR. So you might want to give them an option, but not an opt-out, as it were. You still need to understand what that is, and see where you go from there. So definitely push back on that one.
Thanks, Al. Should we alternate them in case there's any obvious? So the
Yep.
next question is the really difficult question of how you manage and marry absence management with performance management. And if I assume you're trying to tackle the performance management, but you're unable to finish that or get to an end of a cycle because somebody goes off sick. I mean, that is an age-old problem. Are they avoiding the performance management? Are they generally off sick? Are they off sick because it's stressful going through performance management, or a combination of those things? I mean, the reality is it's very, very difficult to continue performance management while somebody is off sick, but it does not go away. And so what you're being clear about is this is where we're up to in this process, and actually we absolutely need to address this when you're back. And then you would move into managing their absence, and you would look at how quickly can we get this person back to work. If you need to go and get occupational health advice, you would make it clear. And I think we haven't really dwelt on occupational health, but the importance of giving really clear instructions to RH, explaining that we were tackling their performance, and they went off sick. Can we still manage their performance? How do we have those conversations? Are they fit enough to participate in that? What support might they need? And then pick it up when they get back to work. Obviously, if they remain off sick and don't come back, you then move into essentially they're underperforming, you're managing their capability because they're off sick, and you're managing their absence, and you manage it through that process. But it is really frustrating, and it's absolutely achievable. It just can take a longer time to deal with that.
Okay, moving on to the next one. This is about holding pre-employment medical information and absence information on their personnel file. In this situation, it's only accessible to HR, and we allow the line manager to view the file in the HR office. I mean, that sounds really a really sensible approach to ensuring that that information is only seen by those who need to see it, and that it is secure. Obviously, you need the information in relation to their medical information to understand whether or not there might be underlying reasons for any future absences, and obviously your obligations to make reasonable adjustments to the extent that that information means that that individual is likely to be disabled. So I think that's proportionate and reasonable in the circumstances. Alice, do you want to look at the next one?
Oh yes, this is one where somebody's refusing to engage. So you've got an individual where there's medical advice, but absences are continuing. You've tried to make reasonable adjustments, but they're essentially not properly engaging with, I guess, either the OH or the advice that's being received as such. And what can you do next? Well, I think you can be fairly robust in this situation, actually, and you can be really clear to the employee that actually we've got to make decisions based on the information that's available to us. We want to get that information, and this is how we're going to get it. When we get the information back, you're entitled to rely on that information. So then I would absolutely think audit trails really, really important. Audit those conversations and what you've the processes you put in place. Also document really carefully the reasonable adjustments and all those things that you have done. If then an individual continues to have persistent levels of absence, you can tackle that under your absence management policy or your capability procedure, depending on what policies you have in place to tackle that, because they're not performing their job to the level that you need them to. You will need to consider if they've got an Equality Act condition. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't tackle that absence in that way, but you will obviously have to have made reasonable adjustments. And then if their absence continues, notwithstanding those reasonable adjustments, you will need to consider, have we got a good reason to continue to tackle it, that we do need them in, and is it proportionate? You might have to live with higher levels of absence when somebody's disabled, but you can absolutely tackle it. And generally that would be through escalation, through a warning process, telling somebody that they, even though it's genuine, you're not doubting that it's genuine, but actually we do need you to reduce your absence. And if not, we might need to consider putting you on a final written warning and ultimately bringing your employment to an end. And hopefully that will focus their mind on engaging with the medical advice and taking proactive steps themselves to reduce their absence if they can as well.
Lovely. I'm going to move on to the question around depression on the basis that the next question I think is answered by your section,
Yeah.
Alice. So this one is about where somebody says that they have depression and have other 1 or 2 day spells of absence. Presumably that's on a regular basis. This is a tricky one because it's possible that the two things are actually linked. And you may not know the extent to which there's a link between their mental health impairment and these other absences. So I suppose, depending on how regular they are, I would probably get an occupational health report carried out to see whether there's a link. If there's not a link, then you can look at invoking the capability sickness absence policy in the way that Alice said. That's not to say even where there is a link that you can't do it, because obviously you do need to have a good level of attendance. You've got a duty to make reasonable adjustments, but again, you can go through a process. But I think probably you need to understand a little bit more about that at this stage.
Thanks, Al. I'll run through. So there's a couple of questions around what happens if someone refuses an OH referral. I think I did touch on that,
Yeah.
but just to be clear, I would absolutely check your contracts and your policies to see if it says that we can require you to go to an occupational health referral, get a medical report. If you haven't got that included, I definitely would, and make sure that wording is broad as possible, so it's not just necessarily when they're off sick or when they're off sick over a period of time. Now, that will mean you can remind them of that, because that will mean that they're in breach of contract for refusing to go through OH, and that's a useful tool to make it clear that it's reasonable to ask. But more fundamentally, it's about saying to them, we need this information in order to make an informed decision. And if we haven't got it, we'll have to make it without it. And that usually, I would say 99% of cases, means that they then engage. The next question is whether an employee who's not been formally diagnosed might still have a disability under the Equality Act. And yes, absolutely. It was quite a long time ago now, the requirement for it to be a diagnosed medical impairment removed, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. So now the tribunals entirely focus on that definition of whether in practice somebody has had a long-term condition, mental or physical, that has that long-term impact on their substantial adverse impact on their day-to-day activities. And that's often driven by the employee's sort of self-assessment of the impact of their condition. So yeah, they definitely don't need a formal diagnosis.
Moving on to the next one. This again is a mental health impairment issue. You've got a lot of adjustments in place, but they're still not fulfilling the entire role of a teacher. And I suppose the question is it expected to be permanent? So that's the adjustment. I suppose the answer to that fairly quickly is that whilst that individual is suffering with that disability or has that disability, then those adjustments need to be in place, because there is a positive obligation on you as the employer. If they're not fulfilling their role, then you might want to think about the pay situation, to the extent that you have set out the expectations as to what pay might look like on the basis they're not doing the whole job. The longer the situation is allowed to go on, though, with the individual receiving full pay, it's going to be more difficult, I think, to row back from that. But I sound a bit like a stuck record this morning. It depends on the facts and circumstances of each case. But
Thanks, Al. We've got loads of questions. We'll have to
I
pick up the
know.
pace. There's someone's asked about whether somebody who is a driver and has been off long-term sick, potentially for a year or more, what that means. And in reality, if somebody's been off for a year and that it's unlikely that they'll be able to return, then that may well be a lawful reason to bring their employment to an end. I would say in all of those cases, you do need some medical evidence before making that decision to protect yourselves, and that's really just to demonstrate that they aren't able to return to work and there's nothing that you can reasonably do to support them back. So I absolutely would get medical advice before making a decision, but then you may be able to make a decision. The positive
Okay.
COVID test. I mean, I don't think these days you can ask for a
No.
positive COVID test. I mean, obviously, we're in a different sort of phase of COVID, really. And if an individual says they've got COVID, just record that in the normal way. But really, that's treated in your absence management policy like flu, like a bad cold, like any of those things. And so it doesn't matter really. That they say it's COVID or not. I obviously appreciate that may mean they're saying they can't come into work for 5 days. But that just needs to be captured, their length of absence, and you can absolutely tackle it in the same way. Although I would, my colleague sent me the name of the, it was a Scottish case, Burke and Turning Point, Scotland, where the claimant was held to be disabled having with long COVID. So there you go for those of you who are interested. Al, do you want to pick up a next?
I would, except it looks a bit difficult, but this is around performance management.
Oh, it was part of the question that I answered. Yes, someone clarifying it.
Yeah. So how safe is it to say that employers not completed the cycle, hence no access to award? And this feels a little bit like less favourable treatment, doesn't it? Or detriment?
I think that's one where you definitely need to take some advice. You'd need to look at what your pay policy says and how it normally applies and how rigorous you are. If generally people who are meeting their objectives move up to the next point on the pay scale, and this person has normally met their objectives before and afterwards and otherwise would, I would probably give them the benefit of the doubt, but make it really clear that it's not being completed. Obviously, if it's more difficult and you have got evidence, that that they wouldn't do that, or you're more rigorous in terms of your performance management process, and then you may be in a stronger position. But generally, you probably need to be slightly careful to just because you've not managed to have the appraisal meeting, if normally they would move things forward. But it depends how much of the year they've been there and things as well. But yeah, I'd exercise a bit of caution there and probably take some advice.
This next question is around emergency leave to deal with childcare issues, and you've now got yourself into a situation whereby your emergency leave is unpaid, but obviously your sick pay is paid. So you've now got one member of staff that is calling in sick, you believe, where in circumstances where she has childcare issues. Again, I sort of referred to this earlier in the presentation. It's really hard to go to someone and say, I don't believe that you are unwell. I think you've got childcare issues going on here. I suppose the best way to manage it is to look at your trigger points in relation to sickness absence, and just keep that employee alive to the fact that you are monitoring her sickness absence. I feel, look, when you're self-certifying the tummy bug, the flu, the whatever, it's quite difficult to go behind that and say to somebody that you don't believe them. It's not ideal, I know, but I think probably the absence policy is the best way to manage it.
Thanks, Al. The next question is around reliance on pre-employment medical questionnaires. Certainly those of you that are in education will do that as standard, because you've got to be satisfied that somebody is fit to work in the organisation, and many other organisations might do it as well. They're really difficult because obviously you'll know the Equality Act was changed specifically to mean that you couldn't ask those questions until you've made the job offer, and the purpose of making the offer is obviously to ensure that they're fit, but really to make sure that if they have got conditions, that you understand them and put adjustments and support them in the workplace. So there's quite a lot of case law. It's really difficult if someone hasn't filled them in completely accurately to say, oh, we're going to tackle this as a conduct issue because you've been dishonest. Really what you need to do is approach it as, you can have a really open dialogue with them, but they will generally be supported in a view that they were worried about being too transparent because they were worried about not getting the job. And actually you should just start afresh with asking them to perhaps go and get, and I think that is when you might intervene and get an occupational health advice to understand what, if anything, they've underlying conditions they've got, are they fit to work, and what support can put in place. But there is nothing more frustrating than a brand new employee having a lot of absence. And obviously if they haven't got an underlying condition, you can absolutely address that and manage it. And they might be in a probationary period and then they're not performing to the level required, but you'd need to just ensure that the underlying issues were dealt with first.
Just moving on to the next one. Excuse me, sorry. I think it's if there's a possibility that this individual has an underlying health issue, and so this question is around where somebody has potential health condition, hasn't got a formal diagnosis, but it's taking some time to get to that diagnosis. They've got quite a lot of sickness absence, holding meetings with them in line with the absence policy, presumably, and managers are reluctant to give a warning at this stage. I think that's probably the right approach. Probably everyone's alive to the fact that this person may well be disabled, and until we get to a position where we understand a bit more about that, it is probably the best route, I think. Not ideal, I know.
The final one is really annoying. An employee who requested some time off, it was rejected because for business grounds, no cover, and then they actually phoned in sick and are self-certified. I think you've done all the right things in investigating. I mean, actually understand, I think you can absolutely say this is very circumstantial. Can we, is it coincidental? Can we understand what you've done with your time? What's the reason for being off? Sometimes you might keep an eye on their social media if you've got
I was just about to
people
say
at work.
that. I was just
That's
about
what
to
we
say that. Yeah.
often see. They sometimes speak to a colleague, so sometimes it does come out when if they've, and then of course you can tackle it as conduct. If you haven't got any other evidence, I think you can do no more than show that you've done that investigation and have recorded it on file. And obviously, if there is further instances of similar, then it's relevant background there. But yeah, worth probing as much as you can. We're nearly up time, but we'll
We are
try and
nearly at
finish
time.
off. Yeah.
Let's just do this one quickly. Your colleagues enter their sickness absence on their HR. This taken as self-certified. We do not request an additional signed self-cert. Is this sufficient? Yes, is the answer to that. And I think that brings us to the end. That's been a really lively session, Alice. Obviously something that has been of real use and interest to you all. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. And thanks for all your comments in the chat. I think we've picked up everything, but if anyone's got any particular questions, obviously please do get in touch with myself and Alison.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, guys.